December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, killing more than 2,400 Americans and drawing the United States into World War II. To millions of Americans, the attack appeared to come without warning, but the road to Pearl Harbor did not begin in December 1941. It did not begin with the American oil embargo, and it did not begin with the failure of one final diplomatic negotiation. The conflict had been developing for decades, shaped by competing ambitions, wounded national pride, economic pressure, war in China, and two governments that increasingly believed compromise threatened their most important interests. So was Pearl Harbor inevitable? Or did the United States and Japan still have a realistic opportunity to avoid war? When most people examine the causes of Pearl Harbor, they understandably focus on the final months of 1941. Japan occupied French Indochina. The United States froze Japanese assets and restricted access to oil. Diplomats met repeatedly in Washington. American intelligence intercepted Japanese communications. And while representatives continued negotiating, Japan's carrier strike force quietly prepared to cross the Pacific. Those events were enormously important, but they were only the final stage of a much longer deterioration in relations between the United States and Japan. For decades, Japan had pursued recognition as a modern great power. Its leaders wanted military strength, economic security, territorial influence, and treatment equal to that afforded the Western powers. The United States, meanwhile, increasingly opposed Japanese expansion, especially its brutal war in China, and refused to recognize conquest as a legitimate foundation of a new order in Asia. By 1941, these positions had become extraordinarily difficult to reconcile. Diplomacy had not disappeared, but the space in which diplomacy could succeed had become dangerously narrow. The story begins in the 19th century. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan with American warships and demanded that the country open itself to greater contact with the outside world. For the United States, Perry's mission represented commerce, access, and national expansion. For Japan, the arrival of the so-called black ships demonstrated a disturbing reality. Western industrial powers possessed the military strength to impose their will upon countries unable to resist them. Japan's response was not to withdraw further. It was to transform itself. Beginning with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan rapidly modernized its government, industry, military, and education system. Within a generation, it had built modern armed forces capable of defeating China and then, astonishingly, Imperial Russia. The victory over Russia in 1905 announced Japan's arrival as a major world power. But the peace settlement created resentment. President Theodore Roosevelt helped mediate the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War. Japan received important territorial and political concessions, but no financial indemnity from Russia. Many Japanese citizens believed their military victories had not been adequately rewarded. Frustration erupted into riots, and some of that anger was directed towards the United States because of Roosevelt's role in the settlement. Japan had won the war, yet many Japanese believed the Western powers still refused to treat their country as a genuine equal. That sense of exclusion deepened after World War I. Japan had fought on the Allied side and emerged with expanded influence in the Pacific. At the Paris Peace Conference, Japanese representatives proposed adding a racial equality clause to the Covenant of the League of Nations. The proposal received significant support, but was not adopted. President Woodrow Wilson's handling of the matter contributed to the Japanese belief that Western governments were prepared to accept Japan's military assistance while withholding equal recognition. These events did not make war with the United States inevitable, but they helped create a powerful narrative within Japan that national strength earned respect and that the West would concede equality only when forced to do so. During the decades that followed, Japan's desire for security and recognition became increasingly connected to territorial expansion. Japan lacked many of the natural resources required to sustain an industrial economy and a modern military. Its leaders looked outward. Korea had already been annexed in 1910. In 1931, the Japanese army seized Manchuria following the Mukden Isthmus and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, fighting expanded into a full-scale war between Japan and China. Japanese forces captured major cities, but China refused to surrender. The war became a costly struggle that consumed soldiers, fuel, money, and political attention. It also transformed Japan's international reputation. Reports of atrocities, including those committed at Nanjing, hardened American public opinion and increased pressure on Washington to resist Japanese aggression. The United States supported China diplomatically and economically while gradually restricting exports that Japan needed to continue its war. From the American perspective, sanctions offered a means of opposing conquest without immediately resorting to military force. From the Japanese perspective, those same sanctions appeared increasingly designed to contain, weaken, and ultimately force Japan to abandon the empire it had spent decades building. That did not mean Japan was merely the victim of American policy. Japan had invaded its neighbors, committed devastating atrocities, and rejected repeated demands to withdraw from China. But it does mean that both governments understood the crisis through fundamentally different assumptions. American leaders believed economic pressure might compel Japan to change course. Many Japanese leaders concluded that yielding to American pressure would destroy Japan's status, undermine the military, and leave the nation dependent upon countries it no longer trusted. In September 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. The following year, Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina. The United States responded by freezing Japanese assets, access to American oil, the resource upon which Japan's navy and much of its economy depended was effectively cut off. Japan now confronted a strategic deadline. Its existing oil reserves would not last indefinitely. It could withdraw from China and accept American demands. It could remain in place and gradually lose the ability to wage modern war. Or it could seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. By moving south meant confronting American, British, and Dutch power. And the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor stood across Japan's path. Throughout 1941, American and Japanese diplomats continued searching for an agreement. Admiral Kiichi Saburo Nomura represented Japan in Washington and was later joined by Saburo Kurosu. They met repeatedly with Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The negotiations were real, but they unfolded while both sides prepared for the possibility of war. Japan wanted an end to American economic restrictions, acceptance of its position in China, and freedom to pursue its strategic interests in Asia. The United States wanted Japan to withdraw from China and Indochina, respect the territorial integrity of other nations, and abandon the use of military conquest. Those positions were not merely technical disagreements. They represented incompatible visions for the future of Asia. American officials also possessed an important advantage. Through the MAGIC intelligence program, the United States had gained access to portions of Japan's diplomatic communications. Washington therefore knew that Japan had imposed deadlines upon the negotiations and that its leaders were considering military action if diplomacy failed. This did not mean American officials knew exactly where or when Japan would strike, but it did mean that they understood the danger was growing. On November 26, 1941, the United States delivered what became known as the Hull Note. It called for Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, and for a broader return to principles of non-aggression and respect for sovereignty. American leaders saw these demands as a defensible basis for peace. Japan's leaders interpreted them as requiring the surrender of nearly everything their country had fought to obtain. By then, the Japanese carrier strike force was already preparing for its mission. Diplomacy continued, but beneath it stood a military timetable. On December 1st, Japan's leadership formally approved war. 6 days later, aircraft lifted off from Japanese carriers north of Hawaii. The diplomatic messages delivered in Washington could no longer alter what had already been set in motion. So, was Pearl Harbor inevitable? Not from the moment Commodore Perry entered Japanese waters. Not from the Treaty of Portsmouth. Not even after Japan invaded Manchuria. History is rarely that predetermined. Different decisions, different leaders, or different compromises might have altered the path toward war. But by late 1941, preventing conflict would have required one side to abandon interests it considered fundamental. Japan would have needed to retreat from much of its imperial project, especially its war in China. The United States would have needed to accept Japanese conquest and restore access to the resources that made continued expansion possible. Neither government was prepared to make that concession. Japanese leaders chose war partly because they believed time was running out and that a sudden, devastating attack might weaken American resolve. They profoundly misunderstood the United States. Pearl Harbor did not persuade Americans to negotiate. It united them. Diplomacy failed not because diplomats stopped talking, but because military expansion, economic pressure, national pride, and mutual distrust had reduced the acceptable terms of peace almost to the point of disappearance. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not unavoidable across every decade that preceded it, but by the final weeks of 1941, the choices made by both nations had created a crisis in which peace had become increasingly difficult and war increasingly likely. I'm Michael Stroud, and remember, history matters because people matter. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you would like the video, subscribe to History with Michael Stroud, share it with someone who enjoys history, and leave a comment below. Every like, comment, and share helps more people discover the channel and allows me to continue bringing these stories to life. I release new history documentaries every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, so be sure to click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. For more historical articles, speaking information, and my latest research, please visit michaelgstroud.com. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.